Now we're going to talk about another technique from ancient rhetoric called topoi. Really, we should just call this topics, but unfortunately, we've already used that word for something else because that word has come into English with so many different meanings that I'm just going to use this old Greek term in order to refer to this slightly more specific idea of argumentative topics. So we're just going to call them topoi. The idea here in ancient rhetoric was, where do you go to find arguments? And they didn't have Google yet, so they couldn't just Google it. They couldn't ask ChatGPT for the arguments. But even though we have Google and ChatGPT, we can't just rely on that either, for a few reasons. If we just go with the arguments that we started with, our speeches will be kind of bland. If we go with that common sense take that ChatGPT gave us, we're only going to go with the most obvious arguments. So how do we discover interesting angles on a particular topic? And the other thing is, if we just go to Google or something like that, we might come up with lots of evidence, but we don't necessarily know where to put that evidence, because one piece of evidence might be used as support for different claims. And in fact, and I've seen it happen many times, one piece of evidence might be used in support of a claim and its counterclaim. People may interpret the evidence differently. So in order to think through something that we're arguing about, we use this technique of topoi in order to just generate possibilities for where we might go with an argument. This technique of topoi led to huge lists of headings and ideas that people could use. And I'm just going to give you here a few that I think are practical and useful. You could come up with your own to do it. And the idea is you would take these headings into your own topic and ask a kind of series of questions that I'll go through here in a casual way, in order to generate, well, what would the reasons be that an audience might think would come out of the relationship between this topos, that's the singular of topoi, this particular topos, and my controversy, my position that I'm arguing. So the first thing that we might look at here are advantages and disadvantages. So probably in every speech that you're going to give in this class, you want to think about what would be advantageous or disadvantageous for a particular action, whether we're describing the things as they already are, a problem in the world that we want to overcome, or something that we think is really good and we want to say why. Well, we have to be able to amplify that sense by showing that maybe it's advantageous in multiple ways or disadvantageous in multiple ways. So here, this is just a very short list of headings of where we might go in order to discover or ask questions about about advantages and disadvantages. So let's say we're talking about sports gambling. Sports gambling has now become legalized, internet sports gambling, and it has become kind of embedded into almost every sports broadcast that I've seen, where there'll be almost proposition bets for almost every individual play that's happening in a game. So one thing we might ask, we're thinking about sports gambling, and maybe we have a general sense of what the arguments are, things like that. So we might ask other questions and say, okay, are there any health advantages or disadvantages to sports gambling? And I might not know the answer to that, but that will now provoke a question that will lead me to think, okay, well, can I frame, let's say, a question of addiction or gambling addiction as a public health issue? And maybe I can go look into that. Have other people done that? How do they argue that? What evidence do they use? Could there be a health advantage to gambling? Maybe it brings people into more conviviality with other people around them. And the Surgeon General of the United States has said that loneliness is the leading epidemic of our time. So anything that stops loneliness might be an advantage. I don't know, but something like that. But maybe the next one, what's the environmental impact of sports gambling? I might not think of that initially because we don't usually think about sports gambling as an environmental issue. But almost every issue might have some kind of environmental advantage or disadvantage. How much of sports gambling happens online? Where is that data held? What's the amount of cloud storage data that's used? What's the carbon footprint for all of that? Has that been calculated somewhere? Maybe I can look into that. Or maybe I'll say, hey, when people are gambling at home, they're not driving to the casino, so fewer emissions. So things like that help me to produce arguments. Not every argument that we produce is going to be strong enough that we want to put it in our speech, but this is part of the process of rhetorical invention in order to discover as many arguments as we can. With politics, we might ask the question is acting in a particular way going to lead to a better or worse political situation? Could there be political backlash from acting in a particular way? Does this create maybe moral hazards in certain ways for certain political blocs, things like that? The economy, we might ask, what's the cost of this? Is this going to create new jobs? Is this going to create bad situations for people in debt with sports gambling? How is that going to be financed? Will that create problems in the financial system? So these are just headings that give us a basic sense of where to look for advantages and disadvantages. Any major institution in society probably might be relevant to think about advantages and disadvantages with. And there's going to be topics that are going to be more specific to your own controversy. So how is this actually going to impact the game of baseball or basketball? There might be advantages and disadvantages that are more specific because of your controversy. So you might think about creating additions to the list that I've started here for you. Next, we want to go into topoi of values. And here, I've paired them off because I think it's good to think about values since we're considering our audience as being a universal audience with all reasonable people in it, that any reasonable person might be listening to your argument. So it might include people that have complex sets of values. And our sets of values may have to kind of pair off against each other. I might value all of these things. I value justice and expediency. That means, the ability to get things done. I might value freedom and security. But one way to think about the values that come up in a controversy is that there might be a greater value than over one or another of these based on what you're arguing. So you might be able to recognize the value in your opponent's arguments or in people who might have a different position than you, but say, nevertheless, this other value kind of is more important. So I've paired some, I think, classic, let's say, classic arguments that happen in lots of different disputes here. So justice versus expediency often comes up in debates where we're talking about how we should act politically or militarily, saying, should we do the thing that's right? Sometimes it's hard to do the right thing, and maybe I would appeal to that kind of value and say, it's really hard to do the right thing. We can't just do whatever is most convenient. We stand by our principles. We stand by law and order. We can't just be doing whatever we think is going to work in the short term. We have to have a much broader and more ethical view. And you might counter that sometimes by talking, and this is, of course, in very abstract terms, because these are topoi. They can be used in many different arguments. You would have to make them more specific to your own argument. How do these arguments fit in? But with expediency, it's the question of, look, we got to be realists. We have to be practical. We need to get things done. Justice isn't going to help anyone if people are not getting fed, not getting paid, if people are dying. So we have to address the immediate problem. So this is often a argument that comes up in a debate, justice versus expediency. Similarly, freedom versus security. We can have arguments about rights, how important rights are, our freedoms. So people talk about the right to bear arms in this country, the Second Amendment, and its interpretation as a personal right where one has the right to bear arms. And some people would say, hey, that's my freedom. And other people would argue, well, hey, this is making us less safe. This is creating a situation where there's mass shooters. We have to have some limits on freedom in order to have security. Of course, both sides here in, let's say, a very kind of standard gun control debate can also appeal to the other values. So someone who's talking about their personal freedom to bear their arms might say, but it's also an issue of security for me. It's my ability to defend myself, my ability to defend my home. If you take away guns from law-abiding citizens. The only people who have guns are people who are not law-abiding, who are criminals. That's going to make things more dangerous. Whereas alternatively, people who support strong gun control legislation might say something like, yeah, I'm concerned with the security of my children and my community and when there's so many guns around, but it's also my freedom to walk around without fear, to be able to ride public transit and not worry that someone's going to have a gun concealed on them. So we might be able to appeal to both of these values, but we nevertheless would want to frame it and say, yes, it might go more in one direction, but even the one you don't think, the value you don't think I have, what are the arguments I could use to appeal to people for whom that value is strong? Pleasure versus discipline. Should we do the thing that's most kind of exciting, most fun, letting our hair down a little bit, or should we be strict, severe, in order to be more principled in how we act? Excuse me. And caution versus ambition. Should we be safe? Should we put safety first, or should we be hopeful? Should we try to shoot for the moon? You might think about JFK's famous line from his Rice University speech. We do things because they are hard. I mean, that's kind of a weird thing to say, but going to the moon, which is what he was trying to sell to the American people at that time, was certainly not the cautious option. It was a very ambitious option for public policy, and it didn't have a great deal of obvious payoffs to the American public at that time. It was an ambitious thing, so appealing to that value was important over the cautious one. But you might say, hey, yeah, but some of those rockets blew up, and if you've been following the recent NASA launches, Boeing is kind of back on the launch pad, and they keep delaying their launch of the new rocket with NASA. And so, okay, maybe it's better to be cautious when we're coming to things like space flight, because it's a very complicated technical process. These are not things that can be sped up and done. We're not making cheeseburgers. Well, even if we are, maybe we should be cautious. So how we appeal to those different values in our audience might lead us to different arguments that we can think about. So as you're going through your controversy, you can think about the values that you think are most relevant to your controversy and to your audience, and find a way to pair those off in order to claim as much of that value ground as you can. The next topos area that I want to look at, or topoi that I want to look at, are stakeholder analysis or responsibility analysis. So in a stakeholder analysis, we might think about who is affected by this issue. So if we go back to sports gambling, who are the people that are affected? And I just want to make a list, and I think I can do that relatively easily through a common sense list. As I do more research and reading, I might find more options to choose from. It might be, of course, those who are gambling. It might be the athletes. It might be viewers of games who are not gambling. It might be taxpayers, or the tax base might be affected because this will be revenue that will be taxed. It might be professional sporting organizations. It might be college sports, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to try to think about as many people or groups or institutions, or it can even extend past human stakeholders, if you'd like, with this kind of analysis, and just say who is affected by this issue. And that can be a way also to arrange a speech, at least a draft of a speech, and saying, let me go through all the different groups of people who are affected. How are they affected? And then we go back to our advantages and disadvantages. Are they affected in unique ways according to health, according to the economy, the economics of it, according to the politics of it, etc.? Another thing that's relevant here is who or what is responsible for effects. So how we think about responsibility can be really complicated and tangled. We often don't spend a lot of time reflecting on it, but one example I often like to bring up is your brake lights in your car. So if you drive a car and your brake lights go out, who's responsible for that? You, legally. And you're not the cause of your brake lights going out, probably, unless you back into something. And you don't even know that your brake lights have gone out, because most cars don't, that I'm aware of, don't have a sensor that tells you that. And they're behind you, so you can't know. So even if you don't cause something and you don't know it, there are cases in which you are made responsible for it. So one thing you might think about are, what are the reasons why a person or a thing or an event could become responsible for an effect? When we want to talk about responsibility, we might be trying to minimize responsibility. So we might say, hey, that's just something that was caused by chance. That was a freak accident. That was a one-off thing. There was no way to prevent that. and that might minimize responsibility. So we might look for arguments like that. Or we could talk about arguments that amplify responsibility. So someone caused something. Someone had a duty to do something, and then they neglected it. So if you didn't act in a way that you should have acted, you can be held responsible. We can think about the environment or the education of someone as being relevant to the responsibility. So if somebody maybe had a really bad education for their job, very bad training, maybe it's the people who were supposed to train them that are responsible, as opposed to that person who wasn't able to act because they didn't have the right sense. So that could lead to mitigating the responsibility. Or alternatively, you might say, hey, no, this person was highly educated, highly trained, and still didn't do it. So this amplifies the responsibility, and so on and so forth. There's also a kind of famous set of topoi developed by Kenneth Burke. He called it the pentad because there are 5 points here. And he used this idea of drama as a way of thinking about human responsibility. He wrote an entire book on this, so it can get pretty complicated. But to give you just a simple sense of it, you can take any situation and break it into these dramatic terms and say, well, what would it mean if I made one of these the bearer of responsibility? How would I describe that differently? So one of the examples he gives is someone who's breaking out of jail. So the act there would be the jailbreak. The agent would be the prisoner. The agency would be maybe like a nail file or something that's being used to chip away at, I don't know, or what is it in Shawshank Redemption? Does he use a spoon to tunnel through the wall? So it would be the spoon. The scene might be the prison itself. And the purpose, maybe that's freedom. So if I wanted to emphasize the prisoner, I might say, look, this prisoner did it himself. No one else acted with him. He's solely responsible. Don't blame all the other prisoners. Don't put the prisoners on lockdown. If I was going to say, that's for agent. If I was going to say that the act of jailbreak itself is responsible, well, what would that mean? And be say, look, well, this is a copycat act. Every time someone jailbreaks, we see tons of other people do it in the country. So we need better prisons in order to, and now I'm kind of going to scene a little bit, but the act might go to scene. We need better prisons in order to stop the act, something like that. The agency would be the nail file. So I might say, hey, listen, the officers are responsible here because they're not doing a good job of collecting the contraband. Scene, the prison. The prison is weak. It's not updated. We need better prisons. We need more secure prisons. Or the prison is a really violent scene, so it makes people want to break away from it. We need to bring a better kind of situation into prisons than we currently have. Or maybe, as some people argue, we shouldn't have these prisons. We shouldn't have people needing to jailbreak. And finally, purpose, freedom. It's like, hey, it's all the stuff that we are educating people about as being really important, as making people want to get out of jail, is freedom. So we can redescribe a scene or any kind of controversy through the pentad, and then by emphasizing one or the other, we might come to slightly different argumentative possibilities. The last one here is just modality. Now, modality, this is probably a topic that if we were going to get really deep into, we would spend far too much time, more time than we have in the small amount of time allotted for this summer course that's online public speaking. So I just want to give you a sense of what might be some of the topoi around modality. And the idea of topoi here are the reasons that would be alive for the audience that you're speaking to. So when you're thinking about it, you might say, well, people will relate to something differently if they think that it's necessary as opposed to just possible. If they think that something's necessarily going to happen, they might say, in terms of, let's say, responsibility, well, if it had to happen and it couldn't have been prevented, then no one's responsible. Or you might say, hey, no, there were a lot of possibilities for how we could have acted otherwise, and you chose this one. That means your responsibility here is greater. Things that are actual, you could say, hey, this actually happened, as opposed to something that you're only arguing from hypotheticals. I'm talking about what actually happened. So we're talking about the fatalities of self-driving cars. You say, you're talking about these possibilities of self-driving cars in the future. I want to talk about right now, back to actuality, and say, look at all the fatalities that have already been caused. We should prefer actuality to possibility. And plausibility, what's likely to be the case? What's serious? This often goes to a sense of example. So by thinking just a little bit about modality, we might be able to make other arguments because our audience has attitudes not just to the specific material that we're talking about, but to the modality of these ideas, that people have different attitudes about what's actual, possible, plausible, or necessary. So as you're beginning to prepare your position and you're beginning arguments and addressing counter arguments, go through the topoi here in order to discover arguments that might give you a fresh perspective on your particular speech.